Welcome to the chapter on rhetorical theory and public relations. I hope that you found the reading somewhat interesting. It's certainly a departure from excellence theory with two-way directionality, mutually beneficial relationships, and so on and so forth, as well as the multiple stances you choose from based on perceptions of threat and duration and opportunity that is brought to us by contingency theory. Anyway, rhetorical theory is pretty interesting. It addresses really the idea of how we actually have meaning, make meaning, or misunderstand each other. And of course, systems theory does not do that, nor does contingency theory. They just kind of assume that understanding exists. So rhetorical theory, of course, is based on the idea of rhetoric, which is known as the contest among multiple voices. And of course, a voice is defined very, very broadly in terms of organizational representation, perhaps opinion of a particular public, the ideas and the definitions that we might associate, or one person might associate with, let's say, legislative action, but their frame of reference may be different than someone else. But the idea of rhetorical theory is that we're always in a contest to be understood or have our meanings or ideas accepted, our definitions valued. And that's pretty interesting, and public relations is definitely right up in there as part of that rhetorical contest. So rhetoric looks at symbols and symbolic language that we use as human beings, which of course separates us from animals, to create meaning. While we also have to pause and realize that not everyone who comes into contact with our words, ideas, images, buildings, designs, etc., will agree to the meaning that we assign or the meanings. And sometimes there's no recognition of agreement or disagreement in the meaning making or the symbol and symbolic using world. And of course, that can cause all kinds of problems. Sometimes it's your boss. So if you've ever been in a conversation with someone, maybe your girlfriend or your boyfriend, and you find you've been perhaps in a heated discussion for about the last 15 minutes and realize you were talking about what you thought was the same thing, but was indeed two very different things. That's called talking past each other, and rhetoric allows us to do that, especially when we don't recognize that disagreement could happen. So rhetoric involves the study of the use and misuse of language and symbols. And so remember, language, words, the look of words, the placement of words, utterances, nonverbal behaviors perhaps, signage, buildings, construction zones, how grids are laid out, so on and so forth. Everything a rhetorician would say is symbolic and holds potential for some kind of symbolic meaning. With that, we could look at the age-old, almost, idea of a bunch of blind people who are experiencing an elephant for the first time. They haven't been told what it is, or they may have been told it's an elephant, but they're trying to refer it to something with which they're familiar. So the person who's up by the ears says, "Oh my goodness, this is a fan." The person who's at the front of the elephant touching the tusks says, "I'm experiencing this like a spear." Someone who has hold of the trunk would experience it as a snake. Someone who's hanging on to a leg as a tree. The person who has the ladder and access to the side of the elephant feels it as kind of a tough, rough, perhaps hairy wall. But the person who's at the rear end experiences the elephant as a rope. Are any of them incorrect? And the simulaic, if you will, the comparison process, not necessarily, but they all each only have one little piece of experience or referent that makes an elephant what it is. The development of rhetoric is really attributed to Aristotle, who was an ancient Greek, and he talked about the rhetor, an individual person. He called it a man because in those days that's what they did, as a good man speaking well, which means being able to represent his ideas through language and symbolism in a way that they were always after the idea that you could engage in dialogue for the dialectical pursuit of the ultimate truth. So he defined rhetoric as the ability to observe in any given case all the available means of persuasion, and it was a tool for practical debate in the persuasive pursuit, if you will, or conversation for the attainment of some kind of truth. And of course, that's what supposed educated people did during the time of Aristotle. He outlined for us the three famous rhetorical appeals you probably had in a public speaking class or a professional presentation class. Ethos is appealing to credibility or a sense of what's credible. Pathos is emotion, feelings perhaps, interpretive ideas, and logic is a social construction, the idea of what makes logical thought. Notice it in your book on page 74. Ethos and pathos are introduced to you and the terms are inverted, so I apologize for that. But a good rhetor, of course, is an artist in the strategic use of ethos, pathos, and logos, and we would really argue that public relations people are certainly that. And that's how we understand an organization's story, make sure it resonates with its mission and its purpose, and we present that story, or sometimes we protect that story. So Aristotle has a model of communication, and we can apply that to the PR process, where he argues that a speaker discovers rational, which is logos, emotional, pathos, and ethical proofs about an idea or organization's story, arranges those proofs strategically, and of course you have to remember, notice in the upper right-hand corner, that the key role as to whether communication takes place or not, the key thing is the person's interpretation, the individual or the groups to whom it's delivered. And of course, what's strategic is based on how they receive, interpret, or understand or communication, or the symbols that I'm using. So in the third square, the third rectangle then, that rhetor clothes the ideas in clear and compelling words, or maybe some images, and of course in Aristotle's time they didn't have a whole lot of images other than maybe buildings or something, and they deliver the product appropriately to the situation in terms of timing, levels of words that are used, depending on the recipient, the kind of channels of communication or distribution, and that is Aristotle's model of communication. We really can apply that to public relations, but what you don't really see here is the feedback loop, which should be a simultaneous kind of thing. Actually, I don't know if it's a feedback loop. That's what's introduced in systems theory, is that we're always assessing and understanding and interpreting our audiences, our intended public. The development of rhetoric then was taken on in the 30s, which is way past the time of Aristotle, by Kenneth Burke, applying it to human civilization or the contemporary civilization. He wrote some very interesting books. One's The Rhetoric of Man, The Grammar of Motives, and a whole host of other books. And he really devoted his life to studying the idea of rhetoric and human beings. He saw men as, or people, as symbol using and misusing individuals or animals, if you will, much like Aristotle. He argued that rhetoric is a means for identification and separation. This is pretty fascinating. So let's say you're a Chiefs fan, but one person in the room is a Dallas Cowboys fan. And even the idea of that is a symbolic thing. What does it mean to be a fan of a football team? And if I'm a Chiefs fan, I am, through symbols, separated from a Dallas Cowboys fan. But if 10 of us in the room are Chiefs fan, then through symbols we are identified together as Chiefs fan, and we believe we're identified with the Chiefs organization and perhaps players. So you see how rhetoric, the use of symbols or the misuse of symbols and language, allows us to come together, to be separate, to identify together because we're not something else, and just all of these really, really powerful kinds of things. So rhetoric then is the use of language as a symbolic means of inducing, and he would say we're just using this strategically, getting people to cooperate in ways we want them to, or that we want our friend to. So we induce cooperation in human beings that by nature we're symbolic. We respond to symbols. And again, they argue that's what separates us to the large part from the animal kingdom. So Burke says that rhetoric really places dialectic, which Aristotle was about. You're dialoguing to find truth, and as Aristotle continued, he talked about the use of persuasion to try to get someone else to understand what truth is as you found it. So rhetoric replaces dialectic with the idea of persuasion, and it's not necessary to find the truth if truth is symbolic. Okay, so kind of interesting. I'd say, we all have different ideas of what truth is. We might argue there's some obdurate, enduring truth, maybe not. But rhetoric is certainly a part of our world, and so is symbol. So then Bob Heath at the University of Texas in Houston, he's a famous rhetorician, public relations person, both as a consultant, especially in the petroleum industry, and as a professor. He's now retired. He adapted rhetoric to organizations, where organizations then become the rhetor, like the good person speaking well, and organization replaces individual voices. So when we say the voice of the Kansas City Chiefs, or the Chiefs have committed to this player, we're really talking about an organization, but in a sense, symbolically, it's been personified, and then it is seen as a rhetor, as almost a person trying to persuade other people. And that's a pretty powerful thing when that happens, because it really does allow it to be seen or understood or perceived as an organization, as something we want to identify with or apart from, and something that could be powerful or credible in terms of offering us symbols by which to interpret the world. So then we use rhetoric, he argues, organizations do, use it with the intent to create collective or organizational meaning and action. And of course we do that all the time. What does UCM mean? What does it mean to go to a university system? How is Sonic different than Dairy Queen? How is it better? How is it less good? Or so on and so forth. And that's how is an organization even perceived as something to which we can belong, or which we work for or with or in. And pretty interesting there too. So as we apply it to organizations, he would say that people, man, is the symbol using, which means symbol making, symbol misusing animal, inventor of the negative, or moralized by the negative. So in a sense, we're not this, so we're that, or if we do this, that's bad, so therefore let's do this. We do this all the time. Separated from our natural condition by instruments of our own making, and a lot of that is classification systems, by labeling others or labeling things as good or bad. Goaded by the spirit of hierarchy or moved by a sense of order, we always want to put things into this is better, best, worst, those kinds of things. And it should say and rotten with perfection, but we're always searching for better, progress, so on and so forth. And there's some really interesting rhetorical analyses of things like God and devil terms. A God term is a term like progress, that if somebody's making progress, we almost always assume that that's a good thing. But sometimes maybe it's not, but we don't even look at that. So if it wasn't, perhaps maybe it's introducing electricity to a culture, a community that's not had electricity before. While it might be good because it makes life easier than trying to burn torches for light, it also usually is seen to be correlated with incidences and increases in crime because people are out after dark. So that's a rhetorical. Okay, so when we put rhetoric with PR, rhetoric then helps us understand that the meaning process in the marketplace of ideas or businesses or competition, or one nonprofit trying to get your donated time compared to another nonprofit. And why is that important? That's all called the wrangle in the marketplace. The meaning of whose organization is better, whose organization should be realized, maintained, questioned, that's contested terrain. And it's also known as marketplace wrangle. And it's a pretty exciting thing, but it also can be a pretty exhausting thing. Public relations people are right in there helping organizations be rhetors in their own best interests or against the interest of something else. So obviously, organizations have a vested interest in meaning creation for long-term sustainability. So people are loyal, that you understand what we have to offer you, perhaps that you will invest in my organization. A rhetorical problem then is identified as any situation we would encounter inviting some kind of responsive meaning, that the organization's story needs to be told, adapted, withheld, or so on and so forth. An organizational exigency then means that is a time when a rhetorical response is absolutely needed. And you can relate this really to contingency theories, notions of threat appraisal, and perhaps a crisis. Well, it would fit extremely well here that, gosh, we can't say nothing. We have to say something. But sometimes it's an opportunity that if we don't take it, we may no longer be profitable. So it's not necessarily a negative thing. Of course, then perception of an organizational exigency does contextualize your perceptions of how important it is, or how threatening it is, or what we need to do, what the intentions against us or for us are. And that goes back to maybe understanding the environmental monitoring, the external boundaries understanding from the article we read if you wanted to do some or earn some bonus points on your assessment test. That the degree to which someone was comfortable with paying attention to the external environment and reacting to it impacted his or her willingness to do so. So it's really interesting. the degree to which they valued it impacted willingly. Okay, so Heath argues there are 7 rhetorical situations. There could be more, but he says these are the major ones PR people come into contact with. Natural disasters, what are you going to do? How are you going to help? How are you going to rebuild? How do you protect people? Concerns voiced by others, it might be by activists. It could be in the form of legislation. It could be in the form of protests. It could be in the form of keeping good employees. Number 3 is recognition of problems that need to be addressed. This is where you're doing lots of monitoring of your environment, paying attention to your publics, looking for maybe threads or trends among employees or your investors or the media that you should address or could address or must address. Sometimes you also look at a rhetorical situation as it's a choice. It's a choice of what kind of product, what kind of service do we offer, which ones do we get rid of, which new ones do we take, what kind of partnerships do we form. There's also the rhetorical situation if your organization's character, its credibility, its reputation is questioned, or you have an opportunity to boost it perhaps, tweak it a little bit, and that also leads into a rhetorical situation that engages a matter of sound policy. Should we or should we not do this based on our understanding of where we want to be, where we can be, and where maybe our environment is taking us or our people are demanding. And then, of course, you have the ultimate exigency, which is a crisis response, is that we have to communicate something because our organization's been implicated or intimately involved in something that's of crisis proportion. It's been shared with other people. It's had some kind of major impact that is not well received. All right, within any rhetorical situation or exigency are 8 rhetorical factors. And of course, you always have to have a perceived exigency or situation or problem. You have an organizational rhetor who has audiences or publics that we have to understand symbolically. We have to have strategic messages adapted specifically for those publics based on what we want to accomplish. We have message sources, so sometimes they come from the organization itself, whatever that is, a news release, but also sometimes we have the CEO speaking in front of the media. Maybe we go to our influencers and have them speak, if you will, on our behalf. We might have a study that comes out that we're sharing something like the trust barometer, so we seem to be more trustworthy as an organization. There's just all kinds of things that could be a message source. Then we have images or opinions of our organization, of our messages, of our past, of our present, of our articulated future in that contested terrain or the wrangle in the marketplace. We look at the channels of communication or channels in all directions and what they say about the message. And then, of course, we also have the opinion environment, which we all know changes very, very rapidly and is full of contradicting and just some really, I guess, argue crazy viewpoints. Heath argues that there are 5 general response types then that an organization can adapt. A little bit like stances, of course, much more general. One is encouraging enlightened choice. It's kind of if you help your publics, which are other rhetors, individual rhetors, engage with the information perhaps or the vision cast by your organization as a rhetor, those people will engage in enlightened choice. Sometimes it's picking the right college. It might be investing in finance with your some kind of financial investments with your company. It might be to not pursue a lawsuit or so on and so forth. There's all kinds of things. And then these are all at a macro level. These are long-term, mostly big things, really. And then they happen in the short term at the smaller level. But number 2 is adjusting organizations to people and people to organizations. And, you know, when I set out, if I was Starbucks to change the way we drink coffee, I was going to adjust people to me. But in the U.S., we want a bargain. And so sometimes Starbucks actually offers a $1 cup of coffee. And we have drive-through windows, which is not thought of in some countries. So there's an example there. That the organizational story is great coffee, convenience, loyalty, indulge yourself, whatever, but it's also had to adapt a lot to the people of the United States. We could also engage in rhetoric based on a situation, a problem, a situation, or an exigency, and we are using rhetoric to build a case based on good reason. And that's a logical point. It could be collaborative, but we're going to build a case for 2-year education with UCM from community colleges because it's an excellent school, has lots of convenient offerings. Perhaps it's one of the more inexpensive, but it's a good reason to get the end of 4-year degree with UCM. Inviting people to use rhetoric. Number 4 is courtship, invitation, and identification. So perhaps a gala event as a message strategy is a prime example of invitation and identification. When we're trying to use celebrities or a feel-good emotional appeal of an organization doing well, those kinds of things would be inviting people to use rhetoric as courtship. And some people argue that any kind of relationship development is all about courtship, and we need to invite some influencers or some of our publics kind of into the inner sanctum of understanding and meaning making as a way to take advantage of an opportunity, and it might benefit everyone involved. And then number 5 is building identifications through shared perspectives, social construction of meaning, and connecting zones of meaning. And so this is where we're very strategic, and we're building alliances with influencers and other organizations that can impact us depending on the situation. And this probably comes as close as you can to the two-way symmetrical model, or total collaboration or accommodation, if you will, in contingency theory. And some people would argue that that's what life is all about, especially if you're trying to maybe have a collaborative lifestyle, ultimate utopian lifestyle perhaps. But many times we have to do these kinds of things, and we do as organizational writers and strategists for the future, whomever we work for. So this is a rhetorical application that we're going to do in class, and so maybe we'll do this or some variation of it. But I hope that this 22 minutes of voiceover help you a little bit with understanding rhetoric and its application, rhetorical theory to public relations.